2, 3, 4. Okay. I think everyone's here. I think there's a preference for English in this room, so I'll be doing my way in English. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right. So I'll give you the call and I'll give you my reasons in chronological order. The final call is as follows, which is the one that was going to be reflected on the ballot. The final call is CO first, second OO, third OG, fourth CG. So it's CO, OO, OG, CG. In my mind, I think CO and OO, very clear, very close comparison. All right, let's start with the OG-OO comparison. The way in which OG enters this debate is to explain that basically with this rise, this necessarily means that in comparison to the comparative, where there is an existence of the gig economy, the rise means that there's going to be more users, more recognition of these kind of apps. This is bad because this leads to casual workers going into this kind of economy where there's likely to be exploitation in many reasons, because there's likely to be general lower payment. There's likely to not be a mechanism of things like strikes that ensure these kinds of protection, for example, in general, meaning that a lot of workers are going to be exploited. They also explain later down the line that there's going to be harms to consumers because there's less training, etc. But I'll later explain why this was not too important in the end for this person. What OO basically explains is to say that firstly, there's going to be more freedom for individuals to be able to choose jobs, which in general is just good because it allows for more work for individuals that have limited time schedules, for example, whether it be people like students, working mothers, etc. Secondly, they explain that there's going to be less exploitation, actually, which is in direct contrast to opening government, where they explain that basically it's easier for individuals to be able to reject work that they do not want to do, whether it be something that's low payment or whether it be working in extreme conditions because they're not tied down by a contract. And therefore, this freedom to choose actually allows individuals to be able to work better. Also, this competition between both gig economies and different companies within gig economies, as well as gig economies versus traditional jobs, means that employers have the incentive to improve conditions for workers, meaning that exploitation goes down. I think they also have a slight bit of mechanism on how this might be better for people, etc., like people like transgender people, like people that aren't necessarily traditionally employed very lucratively. But I do want to note that I think this was a bit of an assertive comparative in which it was a bit unclear to what extent these people benefit from the gig economy, especially when OG is able to push back on this. So I want to talk about this in 3 classes. The first is on the freedom of choice and working thing from OO. The way in which I see this is that OO explains how there's likely to be more autonomous choice for individuals and more accessibility to jobs. The way OG pushes back against this is to say that, this kind of thing exists anyway because there's going to be the existence of the gig economy on either side of the house. I think OO is able to sufficiently push back on this when they say that the rise of this is necessary for the gig economy to, first of all, operate to begin with, especially when there's small margins for cuts that companies are able to get. There needs to be a massive amount of people using this for this to be able to function in the first place, which I think is pretty effective because on OG, they do say that this exists, but I think O is the one that explains that the rise is necessary for this to function. I think the other things that OG says in response to say that, basically you can rather this is worse because there's going to be more people coming in to the platform, like younger individuals, for example, making it harder for vulnerable people to get jobs. I do think this is good in responding to OO's other claims about how you have vulnerable and minority individuals being able to be employed. So I think this washes that claim out. However, in comparison to the idea that these apps would not function at all, I think this is a more important claim because even if it is true that there's some amount of jobs that are decreased for these kinds of vulnerable individuals on these gig economy apps, it is at least better than the situation OO posits, in which these apps don't sustain themselves at all, or this just becomes an unstable form of employment entirely. So therefore, in comparison, this response was not able to take OO's claim down. The last thing that OG says in response is that this reduces political pressure for the government to be able to support individuals and poor people through things like, I think, like financial packages, for example. I think the problem here is just that this depends on the comparative being that there's going to be sufficient government support for these things. I don't think this was a response that was given by OO, but in general, I think there lacks analysis on how the comparative functions and allows individuals to be protected. And therefore, at least from OO, I'm still willing to buy that there's some level of employment that uniquely saves individuals on the ground. and therefore OO is able to win on that autonomy clash. Secondly, on worker exploitation, I do think there are still mechanisms that stand from OG that are left unresponded to at the point of OO, i.e. I think the most important one being that basically there's mechanisms for unions and strikes in terms of traditional companies that do not exist in gig economies, making individuals likely to not be able to negotiate terms. However, at the point in which OO posits that many times these bigger companies also have very strong incentives to exploit workers, as well as things like monopolies that prevent things like competition from being able to, like, create things like strikes, etc. At the point in which this is a bit, I think this casts a doubt on the effectivity of the idea about things like strikes and unions, to the point in which, like, I agree that this might work in some instances, but might not work in all. In comparison to this, I think OO explains that at least you can reject work that is harmful to you or that you do not want to do because you're not tied down by a contract, which I think is also not a perfect claim, but something that is also unresponded to by opening government. So at the end of these different claims, I think that things on worker exploitation to some extent remain, I guess, at least at best a wash, and therefore I don't think OG is able to win on this clash at the end of the day. Lastly, on the quality of things like services, I think this just became a bit less important, not only because OG says, you don't have training, OO says you have more competition, which I think kind of is just unweighed against each other. But I think both teams and the whole round agree that the services like quality thing is just in like principle just less important than the other things in this debate, which is the weighing that all teams employ. And therefore this just on weighing became less important than ideas about things like autonomy and protection of workers, which OO is able to win on, and therefore OO takes it above opening government. Next, I'll bring in closing government. So I think closing government explains basically a new horizontal case in talking about how this is going to harm local companies, either meaning that local companies are going to go bankrupt because they cannot sustain its worker force, or that they have to move to gig economies. And they say that gig economies in general are just bad because this is something that is unstable, has lack of funding, which means that they're like prone to going into instability or going into bankruptcy. In general, the impact that CG posits is that this is in general bad because this harms local business owners, but also secondly, when businesses go down, this leads into things like mass unemployment, and people are going to lose their jobs. I think I'll first weigh this against opening government. I think the main issue that we had with closing government's case is a fewfold. The first thing is that even if I were to buy everything that these local companies go down, it was a bit unclear to me what the impact is, when the comparative is probably that people just can get employed by the gig economy in and of itself. And therefore, when the end impact of CG depends on this idea that the gig economy is just worse overall than local companies, I then have to try to buy the idea that, it's bad because it's unsustainable labor and because you can't do long-term planning. I think the idea that it's unsustainable labor is just in general a bit under mechanized, especially when the context of the debate and all the other teams explain is that there's a rise in this, but also that there's incentive for people to be continuously working here. Maybe it's true that the sustainability of one worker is less, as CG posits. It's unclear to me why you can't replace that worker with another worker, for example, and therefore just the labor shortage thing is unlikely to happen in the first place. But also secondly, the idea that long-term strategizing is difficult was, I think, just a bit under impacted. It was unclear why this in of itself is a harm. And therefore, when CG's impact relies at being people lose jobs, it's unclear why that's true when people can now have jobs in the gig economy, and therefore that impact is just not that strong. The other thing on things like just in general, like local business owners lose their jobs, I think this is something that CEO explicitly points out, but just from the get-go, inherently to the case is a bit unclear why this is that important in comparison to the other standing impacts in the debate. So with this in mind, in comparison to opening government is at least able to prove that there are specific worker protections and there are specific negotiating mechanisms that exist in traditional companies that protect workers. This does not exist in the gig economy and therefore is harmful, is something that OG is able to prove. In comparison to this, I think CG's impacts there remain a bit unstanding. And I know that CG's weighing here is to try to say that this is a bit more of a unique impact. However, I do think OG does explain why uniquely the gig economy is likely to be unstable for individuals, which I think is something that CG also concedes in their mechanism, and therefore OG is still able to take it above CG. Moving on to opening opposition, I think the way that CG tries to respond to OO is to say that, these gig economy companies are unpredictable and therefore they're likely to like have employers leave quickly, which is basically saying that when OO says that there's more autonomy, this is actually bad because this means that companies have like more instability. I think the problem here just goes back to what we said before, which is maybe it is unstable in terms of one worker and how they work, but it's unclear why it's unstable in the grand, vast scheme of the labor market. And therefore, this does not tie back to CG's case entirely. But also, secondly, this response, depends on the idea that there's going to be more bankruptcy, which is a point that I couldn't buy at full. And therefore, OO's case still remains. In comparison to this, OO still has ideas about how there's going to be more autonomy and less exploitation because people are able to choose their jobs more freely, which I think is able to weigh against CG. Lastly, bringing in closing opposition. Closing opposition's idea, basically, is to say that the poorer people and the vulnerable people that we're talking about in this debate are likely to be individuals, such as poor individuals or people of lower economic social standing that do not have things like education, or people of minority or people of color, for example, which are unlikely to be, first of all, able to get jobs in the traditional market to begin with, especially when the traditional market values workers, evaluates workers more more precisely, or like more rigorously, that's the word I'm looking for, because they have to pay more money to them, because they have to pay more worker protections for them, etc., meaning that these people can't get work at all. And then they say that the gig economy expands accessibility to work in general because it's far more easy for employers to be able to employ these people, and therefore this is something that is important. The second thing that CEO talks about is just that exploitation within these gig economies is not that bad. I think some of the mechanisms here are kind of derivative of what opening opposition points out, things like competition and the fact that you can opt out. But I do think CEO adds mechanism of how there's bargaining power based on different gig economy workers coming together and demanding for things, which kind of also take out the core remaining claim of OG, which is that you have unique negotiation power. Lastly, on CO is just explanation about how you get more economic spending. I think the way in which I buy this is that I don't think CO is able to say that there's more economic development, which is a far-fetched impact that I don't think CO is able to mech out to. But I think the extent of what CO is able to say is that there's more utility for individuals to be able to use their money in good ways, which in and of itself is something that is valuable. Firstly, weighing against OO, which I think is a close comparison. At last, the way in which the panel saw this was that I think OO is able to claim that there's going to be more accessibility to jobs of individuals like students, people that are working part-time and want to take up a second job, or people like mothers that want additional money, etc. The CO's explanation of why you get more job accessibility is to explain that people that are traditionally unemployable are now uniquely going to be employed more, or just has more accessibility to jobs because employers are willing to employ people that are less quality, per se to them, in which they can just employ them as a gig worker. We saw that I think CO's case here was a bit more important. Our actors were more important because this targets specifically more vulnerable individuals, such as poor people and undereducated individuals, as opposed to O's mechanism of people that want to get more additional jobs. I think both are good explanations as to why there's expanded job accessibility. I think it's a very close margin, but we saw it on the way in which CO characterizes the types of people they save. We're able to see that this is a more important impact that they're able to drive at the end of the day. I think in general, this is basically the reason. When COO, I think OO also has good material that around mitigations against why gig economy won't be exploitative. But I think CO also has good reasons here as well. Therefore, this wasn't the point of comparison. Next, in comparison to opening government, the way in which we see this is that firstly, I think CO is able to give the responses that take out the remaining material from opening government as to why you get exploitation in the gig economy, i.e. things like negotiations can still exist. I do think that CO also concedes in saying that maybe these jobs in the traditional market are better, but they employ the weighing to say that at least people get jobs to begin with, which is more important than having a no job at all, even if it is exploitative, which is, I think, something that CGO is uniquely able to point out. I do want to note that I think OG's mechanism as to why, this job exists anyway on either side of the house, and therefore the rise thing is the operative word, and therefore CO's case doesn't stand, which I think is the preemptive response that OG gives. Though I do agree that CO doesn't explicitly respond to this rise point, I think the way in which this is nuanced is just to say that in general, obviously, when you have a rise, there's more employers willing to do this, more accessibility to these jobs, and this expands the scope of the benefits that CEO is able to provide. And therefore, even though they don't directly contend that, I think this is sufficient for CEO to take up an OG. Lastly, CGCO. I think firstly on the responses that I think CEO gives to CG is pretty good in talking about how things like local businesses are not likely to be destroyed because there's things like collaborations or local M&As that make these kinds of local businesses also more profitable. I think this is pretty good response to just contend the idea that local businesses go down because the response again from CG is to say that this is like not going to happen because companies care about like local culture and stuff, which I don't think is a strong enough response here. But also, I think CG does not respond to the big bulk of the CEO case, which is about job opportunities. I think there is a good response on the economy development point, but I don't think this is enough to take out CEO's bigger and better point at the end. Therefore, CEO still wins against closing government as well. All right, sorry for taking very long. If you have any questions, please let me know. But because we're kind of out of time, please ask me for feedback or questions on like Discord or something. I might not respond. So like if you don't, you can like text me like 5 times and I might respond. As for the next, what we're going to do next, we're going to be giving feedback to the different judges. So please go back to the rooms you were in before my OA so that the panelists can receive feedback from the teams and the trainees can receive feedback from me. And we'll be doing that for 10 minutes. So please move to the place. Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.